Sam Seder on the Majority Report with Emma Vigeland. Real pleasure to finally welcome to the program Malaika Jabali, senior news and politics editor at Essence Magazine, author of It's Not You, It's Capitalism, Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On. Malaika, welcome to the show. Long overdue.
I know. Hi, Sam and Emma. I'm surprised it's been this long.
It's been too long. You were too busy doing your book for a long time.
Yeah, that did take up. That's a valid reason.
It is a valid reason.
But now we get to talk about it.
Great.
So.
To
I
know. So congrats on the book. Let's just start. Like, who is your audience for this book?
I say that it's people who are socialist and not quite committed to being socialist. So folks who are like, I know that there are some fundamental problems with capitalism. I know I'm not getting paid as much as I need to be. I feel like I've done everything right and I still can't get ahead. I still feel unhappy in some way. And they can recognize that there's racism. They can recognize that there's class issues. They know that corporate bosses can be an issue, but they don't quite have the language to identify what that is. So I'm pulling people who are kind of on the edge and saying, okay, here's an alternative. And, I think a lot of those people are younger people. It's Gen X, it's Gen Z, it's millennials. So it is definitely geared towards my peers and a little bit younger.
The book reminds me of two different, or broadly speaking, there was that book that He's Just Not That Into You,
right? Where
it was sort of like a way of like convincing you that like you need to move on. But also Nomadland. We interviewed the author of that book, which talked about, which is basically ethnography about people's experience in the wake of the financial crisis, and the idea that so many people had that my situation, loss of a home, whatever is a function of something that I did, as opposed to something more systematic. Talk about a little bit about like that sort of like that aspect of, before we get to the sort of he's just not that into you type of thing. but talk about that aspect of like how our system is designed to obscure the structural issues that leave people where they are.
It's through a lot of propaganda, so the structures are created. And then when people rise up to say something about it, there is a whole legal apparatus. There's a policy apparatus. There's a police state that then says, oh, you actually can't talk about it this way. We'll malign you if you think about it in these terms. And so it's really interesting that you mentioned the Great Recession, because I would say that is when it crystallized for me that I was analyzing things through a Marxist take on what was happening, and I identified with it. So I officially became socialist during the Great Recession. I had thought about the ills of capitalism, but it was very historical. It was very abstract. I was looking at the ways that exploiting Black labor, exploiting indentured servants, exploiting wage laborers in the North, the colonization of the Native Americans all made me realize that capitalism was fundamentally built on exploitation and unfairness and immorality in many ways. But I didn't quite identify as anything else. I just knew that this was a problem. But having that personal experience and saying, okay, my family, for instance, was targeted with a subprime loan. There weren't any reasons why we should have gotten it other than the fact that you had a whole bunch of lenders who said, this is an easy target. These are easy targets. And because I had already had a lens of looking at systematic issues just through my studies and environment and upbringing, I was like, I know it's not just me. And then you study more and you realize this is happening to a whole zip code, whole communities, neighborhoods, the country. And so through that, it was like, okay, we need to let other people know that it is not just their responsibility for making it in a society that was not intended for the average person to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, to return to what Sam was saying about almost the construction of your book as being directed towards people and their feelings. It's time to break up. It's okay to feel okay about breaking up with capitalism. Like, there's so much shame that is internalized, I think, on a day-to-day basis, whether it's if you're struggling with student loan debt, if you were targeted by a predatory loan, if, you're not able to make your car payments and things like that. And I really appreciate how you focus on trying to debunk those myths, because it can really, I think, liberate people from that shame and then get them to start thinking less about, oh, I am in some way not living up to this impossible standard. And then you can liberate people and they can start thinking about these structures more broadly.
Right. And I'm really glad that you guys have pointed that out, because I've recognized, I think, in talking about the book, that it is very personalized. Like, it's intended for individuals to kind of wake up and raise their consciousness, which is kind of at odds with a structural analysis, right? Like, we're talking about these larger problems, but I feel like a lot of texts will break down the problems. But how can we allow people to relate to that information? Like, we can break down capitalism all day. We can break down the wealth gaps all day. We can break down the disparity in income inequality and wealth inequality, and how much corporate bosses have been making off the backs of workers. But I think people needed to feel that. And we do have, and I think this is also about empowerment. Like, we do have a say in how this goes, and we can elect those people who then make those kinds of structural and policy changes.
Let's talk about sort of some of the sort of the direct impact, the sort of, I guess, the examples that you use that resonate with folks similarly situated, right? I mean, there are some, like you say, you can talk about sort of more abstract things. You really focus on student debt, because I think one of the statistics that you drop, the student debt in the U.S. is higher than the total wealth held by the entire bottom 50% of the U.S. And I mean, it's just an astonishing figure. That and how much it has. I mean, what's your sense in terms of like what happened over the past couple of years in terms of like there was an influx of support for Americans for like over the course of a brief window over the course of part of COVID, and then it was just sort of like summarily goes away. The moratorium on student debt repayments, support for people with children, just goes away with a whimper, as it were. What's your sense of how people react to that?
How people are reacting to
how that implicates
tapering
it.
of that. I think we lose direction. It's easy for us to get lost and mired in our own problems, and I think that takes a lot of activism. That kind of pressure on an administration takes work, and there are groups doing that work. So I interviewed somebody named Astra Taylor, who's a part of the Debt Collective, a founder of the Debt Collective. And so she's been activating around this and also negotiating with the Biden administration. And I think it speaks to another aspect of the book, which is why I try to steer clear of partisanship, because both parties are liable in this big mess that capitalism has created. And they've both been involved in not mitigating the impacts on everyday people. And so what happens with politics is, I think with anything else, your party wins and there's less incentive to actually put pressure on the government. So even though people said, oh, we're going to push Biden left and we're going to do all these things, that's really hard for some people to do, because then there's more strategizing involved. Well, we want to negotiate with him behind the scenes, and we want to, people are trying to get the little wins and the things for, maybe their institutions or their organizations. And so it just gets atomized. And so I think beyond student loan debt, because that is a federal issue, there has to be a move towards local and grassroots politics. And then also Republicans distracted from, a lot of that work by having us talk about phantom issues, critical race theory, for instance, which is a niche topic in law schools, or trans issues, or what's happening in schools. So we get distracted, I think, in part because of, right-wing agenda. And then we just put less pressure on our team when they're in office.
Let's talk about that sort of like that moment that I think your book is trying to achieve, where you realize that capitalism is just not that into you, type of situation. Like what is how does one is it and I think at one point you in the book you say that this is not necessarily about a lack of imagination, but isn't it? I mean, just talk about that for a moment, like the idea of envisioning, and certainly in my generation, the era I grew up in, conceiving of a socialist society was just sort of, there was no discussion of it. There was no visions of it. I'm technically Gen X, but at the tail end, or the front end, I guess. But the point being that there just wasn't a lot. It really did feel like a lack of imagination. Is that still the case, do you think, or no?
I think it's mostly political will. I think, especially because the book isn't saying, okay, this whole government is going to be socialist overnight. And if you look at the readings of socialist activists and philosophers and government officials, they were still trying to figure out what that looks like. So I think it would take a lot of imagining and conversation and practice to figure out what that could look like, especially in a world where we know socialists are maligned and killed, and there have been coups against socialist governments. So putting that aside, that yes, there will take some imagination, I think, to get into the specifics, there are a lot of basic things that socialists have lobbied for that have been around for about a century. Universal healthcare, single payer healthcare is not a new topic. This is something that came up in the early 1900s under the Truman administration. And even then, you had business interests who lobbied together to say, this is going to affect our bottom line. You had the insurance companies who realized that this could be something that should go into the private sector instead of being a public sector issue. So things like that, thinking about free college tuition, that's not new. We had it in so many states, but then state governments, like with healthcare, they realized that, we're starting to integrate. So we need to figure out a way to privatize so that we are not, so that we can keep these goods, we can keep this common good for certain amounts of people. And those people tended to be white. So people didn't want to share with Black people. And so that's how we ended up retracting from a lot of these public services. Something that I argue in the book is that having the government do things is not socialist in and of itself. It's maybe arguably not socialist at all, because you see it in capitalist countries, but socialists have been the ones at the forefront of those movements. And we can at least get back to having some basic necessities.
I think it's also just about removing points of leverage from capitalists and from people in the private sector. Like when you mentioned their education, the privatization of that, the privatization of our healthcare, those are all things that, when they're decommodified, people are able to kind of live their lives more in the way that they want to, as opposed to if you lose your job, your healthcare is gone. Or, if you don't like your job, well, you have to pay back your student loans because you're so deeply in debt. You're going to stay in this position. And I think that's what makes it so difficult to disentangle. Because the powerful really want to keep those leverage points.
You're absolutely right, Emma. And even this idea of having, an American dream through home ownership, that means you have to stay sedentary. Can people really go on strike if they have to pay a mortgage? People may not mind being evicted in a place where, they might have a 6-month or 1-year lease, but you have a mortgage. You're tied to these people until it's paid off or you sell it. So how committed are we going to be even to movement work if we're so bogged down with these paying for things that are necessary for our survival? So that's absolutely, correct. And this is why we have big corporations who fight so hard against it. Even though it is not like an orthodox socialism, it's taking so many of our goods out of the private sector, out of the financialization sector. So they're having a fit. And so I think, it's something that it's important to recognize.
I think that's the same dynamic too with healthcare. Even on a bottom financial level, removing that obligation from employers would be helpful in terms of like just the sheer sort of financial transaction involved, but it would also cede a lot of control over workers that they don't want to necessarily cede. Let's talk about the relationship between capitalism and race. You talk about the Black radical tradition in the book. How does that interplay work?
I think it's crucial. I think it's so important that I had it in this second chapter, and it's something that we debated. My editor and I, we went back and forth with, just to give people a little background. The first chapter is on capitalism, just the basics of what it looks like, who are capitalists. The second chapter is on race and class through clever references and memes and things like that. And then the third chapter is also kind of an introductory chapter, just looking at what does it mean to be socialist? What has socialism looked like? What are socialist projects kind of around the world? What have they looked like? And so for me, integrating a specific race and class chapter was crucial, on top of weaving it in throughout the book for a couple of reasons. One of them being, I'm thinking of part of the audience here are my girlfriends. It's the Black women like me who feel like we've made it, but people are struggling to say that they are looking at an alternative system, because to them, capitalism means prosperity. Capitalism means, I've sacrificed all this, so why are you trying to take it away from me now, when we've been held back from really prospering, like as Black women, as Black people in this society? We should support Black-owned businesses. So this was a way to talk to my homegirls and say, okay, this is actually what capitalism means, and it doesn't mean that you can't live well. Socialism is about more people living well. It's about the masses living well. While capitalism does the opposite. It focuses a lot of the wealth and prosperity in the hands of a small few, a relatively small few. And if you look at the origins of capitalism, we would not have had it without, again, the enslavement of Black labor, the pillaging of the indigenous. The reasons why so many of the programs that we don't have right now have not prospered or lasted that long is because elected officials used race as a wedge. It was actually astonishing to me how much of the healthcare fight and the anti-healthcare fight throughout the entire 20th century was fear-mongering that communism on one hand and integration on the other would be combined with healthcare. And so if you actually give healthcare to everybody, including Black people, you would destroy the lives of white people, because at the time, eugenics was still a big issue. And so the rhetoric around it, the propaganda, the flyers, the brochures from the American Medical Association, the speeches that one of the chapter leaders was telling amongst his, fellow peers was that, this thing could keep Black people healthy, and we don't want to do that because that would threaten the white race. I learned so much more about the linkages between healthcare and some of these other issues, or even student loan debt. Again, as I mentioned, without that threat of integration, we probably, or people being upset about the threat of integration, we probably would still have cheap tuition today. So it's so integral in how capitalism has been able to survive.
And I should also say, in the context of student debt, Black women in particular have a really disproportionate share of that student debt, particularly from for-profit universities, that where people feel like they've bumped up against some type of glass ceiling without a degree, go and expend all this money to presumably further their career, and it really just ends up being just debt. We've talked a lot about that in the past. So, all right. So you're at that point where, there's an awareness that this is a structural problem. This isn't just me. What do people do? Tangibly speaking, is there value in electing the closest, to the sort of or the person who espouses more than the other person of these sort of socialistic policies? How do we proceed in a sort of a tangible way?
I think that can be a slippery slope. So I steer clear of electioneering in the book. I think that there is power in mass movement and mass organization, where you're enabling people to find a community who can then put demands and strategize together about what they want to do moving forward. I think, of course, all of this is impacted by policy. Policy creates a lot of these problems, but directly trying to figure out who's, the lesser of two evils, this is where it's brought us. So I focus on people joining something. If you've got a union, join that. If you need to have one, unionize. There are, for instance, with the Debt Collective, as I mentioned, it's a debtors union. So they do advocacy work, and they're also working to give people, tangible results so that they can combat the student loan debt that they personally have. So that's considered, they consider that a debtors union. Join an organization. I think capitalism does a really great job, again, of isolating us and making us think these are all of our individual problems and our individual failings. But when you are in concert with other people, it eases some of that burden, and it also empowers you to fight. So joining, you got to join something. I think that's a very easy step. And there are so many groups right now that are getting involved in a lot of different kinds of work that you can find, if there's anything you care about, the climate, if you care about student loans, if you care about, having healthcare, a lot of them lean left. And so there are so many ways that you can move forward through an organization.
And then what follows that? I mean, it just we cede that to the organizations in terms of like rallying for certain issues. Are they is it on an issue by issue basis, or are we looking for more sort of like broader, I guess, all in type of reform or change?
I think all of the above. So if we just look at, as one example, the Black Panther Party, they weren't just a community-based organization. They also had a political and philosophical project that they were working on, right? And they also made sure to have services for the community, because you can't just go around with all this theory and then people are like, okay, well, how are you actually going to help me in my day-to-day life? And you have nothing to offer them. So I think those kinds of organizations are important, where you're able to think about the ideological underpinnings. I think that's so crucial, but you're also doing some work. So the Black Panther Party decided at one point that they were going to be involved in politics. So I don't think it necessarily means rallying around a particular candidate, though it could be, if that, this is all democratic. Socialism is about democracy. So if that's what people decide, then that's what they decide. But I think just looking at the patterns of how some of these groups have worked, elect your own candidates, figure out how those political processes work, decide, okay, do you want to be on the Democratic ballot? Do you want to be independent? See what works in that particular group that you're in. I have been involved in an organization called Operation Power. We do all the, hoity-toity, book readings and political education, but we also elect officials who are socialist or radical or progressive in some way. And so we have to understand, what does gathering petitions look like? Going to the train stations, getting people to get your candidate on the ballot, and then saying, okay, well, which party should they be on? What do people respond to in this community? And we could get, as nitty gritty as you want to. We could get nitty gritty, you know what I mean? It is about coming up with a platform and then saying, okay, who exactly are we going to be choosing for this? Or are we going to abstain from this particular election? So you can elect candidates, and you can also figure out a strategy for people who align with your agenda and endorsing certain candidates. But I do think that political piece is important, like getting involved in politics in some way, even though I'm not, promoting, endorsing any particular party.
I remember a piece that you wrote that really stuck with me. Obviously, and I think it was back in like 2017 about in Milwaukee. I think it was looking at Black voters who had stayed home in the 2016 election. I can't remember where it.
The current affairs.
Was it in current affairs? Okay.
Oh, nice.
And I wonder, like, what give me your sense of how you reach folks like that and convince them that engaging has any value. Because there is a sense that like sort of, and I think it's not specific, to Black communities in Milwaukee. I mean, I think this is the case. I remember years ago, during the Bush years, seeing a documentary where, somebody was talking about how like the Walmart is destroying all the things. And somebody said, well, why don't you get involved with this? It's like, what does politics got to do with this? I mean, and this was in a rural area, with some, rural white folk. I mean, how do you convince people who feel like there is no point to engaging in any of this, regardless of whether it's electoral politics or, for that matter, like organizing around a union, for that matter? And I think certainly the union stuff is like, picked up steam because you can't avoid sort of seeing how empowered it is. But what is the what's the mechanism to get people to see that their actions can have some impact?
That's a great question. And I think part of it is not putting that responsibility on people to feel like everything that they get involved in has to have an impact. But I think they need to see somebody aligning with them making an impact. So if, again, we go back to the Black Panther Party, that didn't start off with some real deep ideological, analysis of the lumpen proletariat. There were community folks who said, we need a stop sign because too many kids are getting run over on this block. And they put a homemade stop sign up there, and eventually the city came around. And so once people observe that the folks who are involved are making a difference, I think you inspire people to get involved. There are some people who may not ever care. There are some people who are too tired. We're working 3, 4 jobs. People have side hustles. They're told they need to be working all these jobs in order to make a living. And so I don't think the onus should be on every single person to have to pick up, the mantle and do something. But I do think you can win people over to at least say, hey, let me check out a meeting because I know this group is doing something and I'm seeing the results of that. And that doesn't necessarily have to be, like you said, it doesn't have to be an electoral win. It could just be something for the community. We've been trying to get speed bumps in this neighborhood for so long. Who's doing something about it? And people will complain. And then you'll have the few at the vanguard who are like, okay, we actually want to do something about it. It's like, okay, let me rock with you, So you'll win people over even if everyone's not going to be deeply involved in the movement. That's just not how movements have worked. But you'll at least get people to align and support. And they might go to, the polls if they see one of your candidates is doing something.
I noticed too how, just to take it out of the U.S. context for a bit, that you do try to make your case to take it to a global scale, right? I mean, you center or you open your second chapter talking about Evo Morales, or has a quote from him in there, if I'm not mistaken. Why was that so important for you to make that case and not keep it confined to domestic politics in the U.S.?
Well, I started off wanting to do more internationally, but I also know, I hate to say it like this, but a lot of us only care about what's happening within our borders. Like we can be a little bit ignorant and we don't really see the connections abroad. But I think there are good examples outside of the U.S. context, and not just for looking at capitalism's failures, but looking at worker movements, looking at how people have had fundamentally different values than Western ones. Like the U.S. is based on individualism. That's a Western and European ideal. But there are some communities who have thought about communal values for eons. In Bolivia, part of their constitution is based on this idea of collectivism. in a lot of West African countries really all over. They believe in collectivism. And so I think it allows us to step outside of this trope that it's human nature to be selfish. It's human nature to only want to look out for yourself. Of course, capitalism works because it's a reflection of how we all are. Capitalism works because it has, in large part, killed off opposition. It works because it has propagandized us out of alternatives. It has focused so much on the fact that this is an innate idea that's natural and works, instead of something that is built on exploitation and clear policy, distinct policy that has kept us thinking this way. And so when you look outside of this Western bubble, you realize that everybody isn't doing this way, and they haven't always done it this way.
Malaika Jabali, senior news and politics editor at Essence Magazine. The book is It's Not You, It's Capitalism, Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On. Thanks so much for coming on. We'll put a link to the book at majority.fm. Hope to have you back very soon. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Thanks so much.